And I thought I would start off by talking about how I got here. Some people are surprised that an ex-warden of San Quentin State Prison would be against the death penalty. And what I want to say to you tonight is that I would be surprised if an ex-warden of any prison that carried out execution wasn't against the death penalty. Because having been involved in the death penalty and the issues surrounding the death penalty for so many years, I know the impact it's had on me and others who have been wardens in prisons that had the death penalty. Let me start by talking about my journey. I grew up in rural Sonoma County. I graduated from Sonoma State University in 1978 with a degree in criminal justice. And 2 weeks later, I found myself working on the tiers of San Quentin State Prison as a correctional officer. 1978, that's when the death penalty was put back in place. So when I started there, within a few months, there were a couple of inmates on death row. The original death row at San Quentin State Prison is 68 cells in a unit called North Seg. Today, we have 720 inmates on death row. We have long ago outgrown the 68 cells at San Quentin. And the state struggles to look for an answer as to what we are to do with this issue of capital punishment. And we hope that that will be decided in 2012, and I'll talk more about that. I also want you to know that I've spent 30 years in criminal justice, 30 plus years actually. I care about public safety. I care enough to spend a lifetime studying criminal justice. I know what works, and I know what doesn't work. And the death penalty, plain and simply, is costly, ineffective, and fails to improve our lives in any way. There is something for everyone, whether you're a liberal, a conservative, and somewhere in between, to hate about the death penalty. Having spent over 26 years at San Quentin and carrying out 4 executions, I feel like I've seen the death penalty from every point of view. There are only a few people who can say what I have just said, and more of these people, former wardens like myself, are speaking out. Morally, I'm against the death penalty, but I didn't come here tonight to talk about my moral view of the death penalty. We could debate that on, and people do that consistently without getting to any resolve. So I come today to talk about the death penalty as a failed public policy that serves no one. Let me begin by talking about the cost. How many of you saw the Alarcon-Mitchell report or read about it in the newspaper in the last year? Anybody? Okay. So Judge Alarcon is with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal. He is in favor of the death penalty. A former law clerk of his is a professor, Paula Mitchell, at LMU. The two of them decided to look at the death penalty and look at the cost of it. And they had access to facts and figures that none of us have access to. They wrote a very comprehensive report of their findings. Judge Alarcon in favor of the death penalty, Professor Mitchell against the death penalty. But they concluded that the state of California has spent $4 billion on capital punishment since 1978. $4 billion. We have executed 13 people. That means we've spent $308 million per execution. If we continue with capital punishment as it is today without fixing what's broken about it, we will spend $9 billion by 2030. That means that we spend $184 million more per year on inmates on death row than if they had life without possibility of parole. And then there's this thing about what to do about building a new death row in Marin County. When I was the warden, I got approval under Governor Davis to build a new death row at San Quentin. And the cost was then determined to be $210 million. And I was told there was plenty of money. $210 million would build a new death row that would last until 2040. The most recent price tag for a new death row was $400 million. And Governor Brown rightly so, with this economy, stop the project altogether. So the state still has to struggle with what to do with death row inmates if we're going to continue to have the death penalty. Now there's those who say, well, just move them to those prisons off in the desert, or, take them to Pelican Bay. And the reason we can't do that in this state is our penal code says that if you're a male and you're sentenced to death, you will be sent to San Quentin State Prison. It is very specific. We've had several efforts to try to change the penal code in my 30-year career. And all of those failed because the communities that we wanted to move death row to said, not in my backyard. So as long as we have the death penalty and as long as we have politics, inmates that are sentenced to death will be sent to San Quentin State Prison. At least that's my view of it, having experienced all efforts to try to do something about that. So we will eventually have to build a new death row, and who knows what the cost of that will be as the price of cement continues to go up, because prisons are primarily made out of cement. And so we have to think about, is that how we want to spend our money? Then if we were able to move death row to one of these prisons in the desert or elsewhere, the cost of death penalties would go up even further, because you have the cost of attorneys traveling to more rural areas. And it's even hard now to get attorneys to take these cases because they're so time intensive, and you're taking a case for life. And the pay isn't that great. So it will be even harder to find attorneys, which would make the death penalty even less effective. Right now, the average wait time from the time a person is sentenced to death until they get an attorney to proceed with their appeals is 6 years. 6 years. And that time continues to go up. So how does the cost of the death penalty impact you and me? Public safety. Well, did you know that 46% of homicides go unsolved in the state of California? 46%. 56% of rapes go unsolved each year. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of money. I mean, rape kits are sitting on shelves waiting to be tested because police departments don't have the money to proceed with the testing of those kits. And you probably have read in the newspaper, many cities like Oakland have had to lay off police officers, even though, police on the streets make us safer. So are we really utilizing our criminal justice dollars effectively by spending it on the death penalty? And what does the science of criminal justice say about all of this? Well, we know many things. We know the best way to prevent crime is to solve it. So when you have a higher solve rate, you reduce your crime rate. So if we spend our money solving unsolved homicides or unsolved rapes, it would reduce the amount of those activities. And we also know that when you have more police on the streets, it makes all of us safer because you prevent crime. You have a professor out of UC Berkeley who released his book in the last month that talks about New York as an example. And what they found is where there were police, you prevented burglaries. The burglar didn't come back the next day. You prevented a burglary for forever in that area, as long as you kept a routine way of keeping police in those neighborhoods. And so we know more police you have on the street, the lower the crime rate you have. In fact, New York is really a wonderful example. New York's crime rate is 40% less in every violent category than California. And they don't have a death penalty. And they're locking up less people in prisons. And why is that? Because they're using data-driven police decision-making, evidence-based practices in their policing. Have any of you read about that? It's really a fascinating, few people. It's really fascinating, and I really encourage you to get the book that has just come out about this topic, because it really is, the research is really showing that's what works. So the death penalty is not a deterrent. Punishment must be swift and certain. You learned that in Criminal Justice 101, if any of you took Criminal Justice 101. The death penalty is not swift, nor is it certain. In fact, not only does the death penalty fail to deter crime, it punishes victims. The death penalty is a hollow promise, as the DA of San Diego has called it. What happens to victims is they are told that the death penalty will somehow bring closure to what has happened to them. But what happens to victims' family members is they wait years for that to occur. They go through appeal after appeal, sometimes more than one trial. It is a very painful process. And we've had 13 executions. So if a family member is waiting for that to occur, it just doesn't work for them. One must just look at the facts. The states that utilize the death penalty have the highest crime rates. Texas, Georgia. The states that don't have the death penalty or don't utilize the death penalty have lower crime rates. Excuse me. As Clarence Darrow observed on his study of the history of punishment, this is a quote from him, "Gradually the laws have been changed and modified, and men look back with horror at the hangings and the killings of the past. What did they find in England? That as they got rid of those barbaric statutes, crimes decreased instead of increased. As the criminal law was modified and humanized, there was less crime instead of more." And that's true. You can look at the comparison of violence in European countries compared to the United States. Our murder rate is twice as high as most European states and countries, and in some cases 4 times as high. And they don't have the death penalty in any European country. In fact, many states are placing more of their resources and efforts on what works, rethinking sentencing policies and finding that crime can be reduced by using data-driven policing and crime prevention strategies. The death penalty is practiced in so few states. We have the death penalty in many states in the United States, but it's practiced in so few states that only a small number of counties within each state actually seek the death penalty. So in California, there's about 10 counties. Even in Texas, there's only 3 or 4 counties that seek and practice the death penalty. So geography, where you live, may determine what your punishment will be. And this adds to the argument that the death penalty is not a deterrent, because it is not swift, nor is it certain. And let's talk about retribution. Excuse me, I seem to be losing my voice. If you believe punishment must be harsh, then I can tell you that life without possibility of parole, LWOP, is a very harsh punishment. During my time as warden, 3 individuals asked for the death penalty because they couldn't bear the thought of spending the rest of their life in prison. The thought of spending the rest of their lives inside prison was unthinkable to those 3 individuals. It is important to think about what life is like on death row as opposed to a person whose life without possibility of parole. If you're on death row, you have an attorney for life. You actually have a legal team for life once you get your attorneys. That legal team visits you, sends you TVs, books, magazines, cares about you. If you're life without possibility of parole, you don't get those same things. You get 1 appeal, as every person convicted of a crime in the state does, and that takes about 18 months. After that, you have no opportunity to be released unless you prove yourself innocent. But if you have a life without possibility of parole and you are innocent, you have the ability to prove yourself innocent, and that's very important. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So retribution. As a very conservative Republican, Patrick Sheehan from the Oregon House of Representatives recently wrote, Until recently, I was 51 to 49% in favor of the death penalty. A shrug of the shoulders often reflected my indifference and disdain for someone who committed the most heinous atrocities in our society. Whether they lived or died was of no consequence to me. Truth be told, I would rather not share a planet with someone like Gary Hodgin. Gary Hodgin was the inmate that was going to be executed in Oregon until the governor stopped that execution. Going on with what the Republican senator said. This February, less than a month after being sworn in, I toured the Oregon State Penitentiary to research a handful of bills intended to save money in prison's healthcare delivery system. What I saw in the penitentiary infirmary that day tipped my opinion on Oregon's death penalty and compelled me to take a stand. At that moment, I knew it was okay to be tough on crime and still be against the death penalty. The two principles are not contradictory. The death penalty rewards antisocial criminal behavior with attention, the front page of the newspaper or the leading story on the 5 o'clock news. In Hagen's case, we almost acquiesced to his request to die rather than face a dreary lifetime without purpose behind bars. We wouldn't give an inmate a flat-screen TV if he asked for it, so why would we give Hagen the comfort of escaping his obligation to pay for his crimes? Representative Jeanne went on to conclude, I think it's fair to say that most who favor capital punishment do so out of a desire to convey their disgust and indifference toward these vile criminals in the strongest tone possible. I can convey the same with life without possibility of parole, knowing they will die in prison after a long and purposeless life. I don't agree with all of his comments, but here you have a very conservative individual who has come to a different understanding and understands that life without possibility of parole is a harsh punishment that holds people accountable. And victims. I can never speak for the hurt and the loss of victims, but I will tell you that within my organization, we have the California Crime Victims seeking alternatives to the death penalty, and that is a rapidly growing organization. We have over 700 members. These members recognize that the death penalty does nothing to improve criminal justice and leaves so many people waiting for justice. This is a heavy burden on victims' families and so unfair. I know that these are horrific crimes that people must deal with, but I know from firsthand experience the years of appeals, retrials, and more appeals is so hard on these family members. Thank you. Life without possibility of parole brings legal closure for these family members. They do not have to relive the crime over and over again, or sit through courtrooms again and again, or read about them in the newspaper. And then, what about those of us who must carry out this punishment? I think of the Troy Davis execution. How many people know about Troy Davis, Georgia? We don't know if Troy Davis was innocent or guilty. That really is the problem. As a result of that, 6 wardens, including myself, wrote a letter to the officials in Georgia asking them to stop that execution, saying, you don't know what you're doing to your staff. They're going to carry out an execution not knowing whether the person they're executing is innocent or not. Is that really something we can ask public servants to do? Across the United States, 139 exonerees have been found on death rows. There's Mr. Willingham in Texas, who was actually executed, and we now know he was innocent. He was convicted of a fire that ended up killing his children based on science that doesn't exist. In fact, the leading experts in science today now know that that fire was started by a faulty heater. They have found other individuals in Texas who were convicted with that same science who have now been exonerated. In my own personal experience with 4 executions, I ask people to think about this. Imagine getting up every morning 30 to 60 days prior to an execution, because that's how long you know that you're going to execute a person. You get that death warrant 30 to 60 days before the set date. And you go to work each day knowing that you're going to work to plan to kill a human being. And if you're the warden, you know you're going to work to lead your staff through the process of killing a human being. You go to work knowing that you're actually going to work to train your staff to kill a human being. It has an impact on you. Now, when you're in that leader role and you're up there trying to convince everybody that it's all okay and it's all right, you don't realize that impact until you walk away from it. And one of the executions that I carried out was on a gentleman who volunteered, and we call them volunteers when they stop their appeals. At the point that he decided he'd had enough, he'd been on death row for 26 years, he was older, in a lot of pain, tired of being in prison, and said, enough's enough, it's time to execute me. So for those 30 to 60 days, I went to work each day planning to help a human being commit suicide and telling my staff. I think we need to think about the impact on public servants. That's true, people volunteer for these jobs. I didn't have to be the warden at San Quentin. But I don't think you want people who want to go there to execute people. I mean, you want people like me in criminal justice. And there's many of us. At the end of every execution, one of my staff would say to me, "Is the world safer because of what we did tonight?" And there would be silence. None of us answered that question because we knew the answer was no. After all the fanfare, after all the cost, after all the ceremony, we knew we had done nothing to improve the world. My journey, like so many others, has brought me to do everything I can to replace the death penalty. And the Save California campaign is our answer to the death penalty. And the Save California campaign does three things. It takes the existing law, we've kept it very simple on purpose. It takes the existing law and crosses out death penalty and leaves life without possibility of parole as the harshest punishment available in the state. It requires that all inmates serving life without possibility of parole work and pay restitution to the Victims' Compensation Fund. And it sets aside $100 million over a 3-year period to solve unsolved homicides and rapes. And why does the initiative do those three things? Because that's what the voters say they want. They want people held accountable, they want people to work, and they want people to pay restitution. We know that life without possibility of parole is cheaper than the death penalty. We know that it is effective, we know that it holds people accountable, and we know that it keeps you and I safe. And that the voters understand that. That is why in our recent polls, 55% of the voters say that when given the choice, they would choose life without possibility of parole over the death penalty.